What happens when you give the world's brightest minds a blank check and tell them the fate of civilization is at stake? You get 6 years of terrifying, brilliant, and sometimes ridiculous innovation. The Second World War wasn't just fought on battlefields. It was fought in laboratories, on testing grounds, and on the back of cocktail napkins. It was a pressure cooker for technology, forcing a leap forward that might have taken decades in peacetime. Some of these inventions changed the world forever. Others were spectacular failures. Many were so secret that their stories are still being pieced together today. We hear about the famous ones, but what about the bombs carried by bats? Or the aircraft carriers made of ice? What about the flying bomb that was just a giant unguided firecracker? These weren't just weapons, they were desperate gambles, acts of sheer genius, and sometimes ideas that bordered on insanity. They show us what humans are capable of when pushed to the absolute limit, how far is too far, and how many of these strange ideas are still influencing the technology we use today, hidden in plain sight. Number 19, could a single bomb really end a war? The idea started with a letter. In August 1939, just before the invasion of Poland, Albert Einstein signed a letter to US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. It warned that German scientists had figured out how to split the uranium atom. This process, nuclear fission, could lead to a bomb of unimaginable power. The letter urged the United States to start its own research program. The fear was simple: what if the German Reich built it first? That fear gave birth to the most secret and expensive project of the entire war, the Manhattan Project. It wasn't just a project, it was a secret, sprawling industry. It employed over 130,000 people and cost about $2 billion, which would be over $30 billion today. Most of the people working on it had no idea what they were building. They just knew their work was vital. The project was led by two very different men. General Leslie Groves was the military man, a hard-nosed engineer who had just finished building the Pentagon. He was the muscle, the organizer who got things done. Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer was the scientist, a brilliant, charismatic, and complicated theoretical physicist. He was the brain, tasked with assembling a dream team of scientists in a remote location to solve the puzzle of the bomb. That location was Los Alamos, New Mexico, a place so secret it didn't officially exist. On this dusty plateau, Oppenheimer's team worked on two different types of atomic bombs. The first was a simpler design called Little Boy. It worked like a gun, firing one piece of enriched uranium-235 into another to start a chain reaction. They were so confident this design would work that they never even tested it before use. The second design was much more complex. Called Fat Man, it used a sphere of plutonium. To get the plutonium to undergo fission, you had to crush it with perfectly timed conventional explosives. This implosion had to be perfectly symmetrical, a massive engineering challenge. The whole project came to a head on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert. The test was codenamed Trinity. They hoisted the Fat Man device to the top of a steel tower. Nobody was sure what would happen. Some scientists worried it might ignite the atmosphere, though calculations suggested this was unlikely. At 5:29 a.m. it detonated. The flash was brighter than the sun. A mushroom cloud soared 40,000 feet into the air. The heat melted the desert sand into a green glass, later named Trinitite. Oppenheimer, watching from a bunker, later said a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, came to his mind: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a terrifying success. Less than a month later, on August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, on August 9th, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was absolute. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender, officially ending the war. The atomic bomb had done what it was designed to do. It ended the war. But it also unleashed a new kind of fear into the world, starting the nuclear age and the Cold War that would define the next half-century. The story is well documented in Richard Rhodes's definitive book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which details the science, politics, and personalities behind this world-changing weapon. But what don't we know? Was the second bomb, the one dropped on Nagasaki, truly necessary from a military standpoint, or was it also a signal to the Soviet Union? How many other nations had secret atomic programs, and how close did they really get before the war ended? And if the Trinity test had failed, would a bloody invasion of Japan have been the only alternative, potentially costing millions more lives on both sides? Number 18, what if a bomb had its own engine? Before the world worried about ballistic missiles, it worried about the buzz bomb. It was officially called the Fieseler Fee 103, but the British gave it a more descriptive name based on the sputtering sound of its engine. the V1, or Vergeltungswaffe 1. Vengeance Weapon 1 was one of the world's first cruise missiles. It was a pilotless, flying bomb designed not for military targets, but to spread terror among civilians. It was a new kind of warfare. The idea was to create a weapon that was cheap to build and didn't risk a pilot's life. The German Air Ministry pushed for the project, and development began in earnest at Peenemünde, a remote research facility on the Baltic coast. The V-1 was a simple machine. It was essentially a small airplane with a warhead packed with about 1,870 pounds of explosives. The genius was in its engine. It used the pulse jet, a very basic type of jet engine. It worked by igniting a fuel-air mixture in a long tube, creating a series of explosions, or pulses, that pushed the craft forward. This created the infamous buzzing or sputtering sound that would haunt the skies over southern England. It was launched from fixed ramps, mostly located in occupied France and the Netherlands. The guidance system was rudimentary. It used a simple autopilot with a gyroscope to keep it level and flying in a straight line. A small propeller on the nose was connected to a counter. After a set number of rotations, which corresponded to a pre-calculated distance, the counter would cut the engine. The V-1 would then dive towards the ground. This was its most terrifying feature. For people on the ground, the buzzing sound was a constant source of anxiety. But the moment the buzzing stopped, they knew the bomb was falling. That silence was the real terror. The first V-1 attack on London was on June 13th, 1944, just a week after the D-Day landings. Over the next few months, more than 9,500 were fired at England. The attacks were relentless, they were inaccurate. You could aim a V-1 at London, but you couldn't aim it at a specific building. It was a weapon of pure chance and fear. It caused widespread damage and killed over 6,000 people. The British developed several defenses: anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons with trailing cables, and fast fighter planes like the Spitfire and the new jet-powered Gloucester Meteor were used to shoot them down. In a risky maneuver, fighter pilots would sometimes fly alongside a V-1 and use their wingtip to flip the V-1's wing, toppling its gyroscope and sending it crashing into the countryside. The story of the V-weapon program is detailed in books like V-1, V-2, The Long-Range Vengeance Weapons by Stephen J. Zaloga. Ultimately, the V-1 campaign was stopped when Allied ground forces overran the launch sites in France. But the concept was proven. A cheap, mass-produced, unmanned weapon could cause significant disruption and fear. It was the ancestor of every modern cruise missile used today. But questions remain. How much did the V-1 campaign, by diverting resources and attention, actually help the Allied advance after D-Day? Did the psychological impact of the V-1 on the civilian population come close to breaking their morale as its creators intended? And what secret V-1 variants, perhaps with better guidance or larger warheads, were on the drawing board when the launch sites were captured? Number 17, could you build a rocket that touches space? If the V-1 was a crude but effective weapon of terror, its successor was a quantum leap in technology. The V-2 rocket, or Vergeltungswaffe 2, was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It was a weapon so advanced that it was essentially a spaceship, an object that could travel to the edge of space before falling back to Earth at supersonic speed. There was no defense against it. You couldn't shoot it down. You couldn't even hear it coming. The explosion was the first sign that one had arrived. The mastermind behind the V-2 was Wernher von Braun, a brilliant and ambitious young engineer. Von Braun wasn't primarily interested in building weapons. He dreamed of space travel, but he knew that the only way to get the massive funding needed for rocket research was through the military. He and his team worked at the secret Peenemünde Army Research Center. Developing the V-2 was an immense challenge. It was a 46-foot-tall rocket that used a sophisticated liquid propellant engine, burning a mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen. This was incredibly complex and dangerous technology for the 1940s. The guidance system was a marvel. It used advanced gyroscopes and accelerometers to guide the rocket during its powered flight. After about 65 seconds, the engine would cut out, but the rocket would continue to climb on its momentum, reaching an altitude of over 50 miles right at the edge of space. From there, it would fall in a ballistic arc, reaching speeds of over 3,500 miles per hour. The entire flight from launch in the Netherlands to impact in London took about 5 minutes. The first V-2 was launched against Paris on September 8, 1944, followed by London later the same day. Over the next 7 months, over 3,000 V-2s were launched. They were even more inaccurate than the V-1. Their main purpose was, again, psychological. The fact that there was no warning and no defense made them terrifying. An estimated 9,000 civilians and military personnel were killed by V-2 attacks. However, the human cost of building the V-2 was far higher. The rockets were constructed in a brutal underground factory called Middlework, using forced labor from concentration camps. It is estimated that more people died building the V-2s than were killed by them. This dark side of the program is a crucial part of its history, explored in works like Michael J. Neufeld's The Rocket and The Reich. When the war ended, the V-2 technology became one of the most sought-after prizes. Both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture the German rocket scientists and their hardware. Wernher von Braun and over 100 of his key personnel surrendered to the Americans in an operation codenamed Operation Paperclip. They were brought to the United States, where they formed the core of the American space program. The V-2 rocket that was designed to destroy cities became the direct ancestor of the Saturn V rocket that took humanity to the moon. But deep mysteries still surround the program. Were the Germans working on a two-stage intercontinental version of the V-2, a so-called America rocket capable of reaching New York? What other advanced rocket designs were being tested at Peenemünde when it was abandoned, and how much did von Braun and his team truly know about the horrific conditions under which their rockets were being built? Number 16, what if a fighter jet had no propeller? For most of the war, the skies were dominated by propeller-driven aircraft. Fighters like the Spitfire, the Mustang, and the Zero were the pinnacle of piston engine technology. But in the final year of the conflict, a new sound was heard in the sky. It was a high-pitched scream. It belonged to the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was so far ahead of its time that Allied pilots who first encountered it could barely believe what they were seeing. The concept of jet propulsion had been around for a while, but building a reliable jet engine was a huge technical hurdle. The German engineers, particularly Hans von Ohain and Anselm Franz, made critical breakthroughs. Franz developed the Junkers Jumo, four-engine, the power plant for the Me 262. These early jet engines were temperamental. They had a short lifespan, sometimes lasting only 10 to 25 hours, and were prone to flaming out if the pilot handled the throttle too aggressively. But they produced immense thrust. The Me 262, nicknamed the Schwalbe Swallow, was a revolutionary aircraft. It was sleek, with swept-back wings for high-speed performance. It was armed with four powerful 30mm cannons in the nose, a concentration of firepower that could destroy a B-17 bomber with a single short burst. Its top speed was over 540 miles per hour, about 120 mph faster than the fastest Allied propeller fighter. This speed was its greatest advantage and its primary defense. Allied pilots simply couldn't catch it in a straight line. Their only hope was to attack it during takeoff or landing, when it was most vulnerable. The first Me-262 units became operational in the summer of 1944. Their impact was immediate. They were devastatingly effective against the large, slow-moving Allied bomber formations. The famed test pilot Captain Erich Winkel, Brown of the Royal Navy, who flew almost every major aircraft of the war, described his first flight in a captured Me-262 as a revelation. He knew immediately that everything else was obsolete. However, the program was plagued by problems. The regime's leadership interfered, demanding the aircraft be redesigned as a fighter bomber, a role it was not suited for. This delayed its introduction as a pure fighter. There were also constant shortages of fuel, spare parts, and experienced pilots. Despite being produced in relatively small numbers, around 1,400 were built, but only a fraction saw combat. The Me-262 demonstrated the future of air combat. The lessons learned from its design and operations were invaluable to both the Americans and the Soviets after the war. An aircraft like the American F-86 Sabre and the Soviet MiG-15, which fought each other over Korea, owed a direct design lineage to the Me-262. The story of its development and impact is covered in detail in books such as Me-262 Stormbird Ascending by Colin D. Heaton. Yet, crucial questions linger. If the Me-262 had been introduced as a fighter just 6 months earlier, and in greater numbers, could it have stopped the Allied bombing campaign and changed the outcome of the air war over Europe? Were there more advanced jet designs being worked on that were even closer to production? And how much did the unreliability of its engines, a secret well kept by its pilots, limit its true effectiveness in combat? Number 15, Did a flying wing exist in the 1940s? It looked like something from the future. It had no tail and no fuselage. It was just a single, graceful, swept-back wing. The Horton Ho 229 was one of the most radical aircraft designs of the Second World War. It was a jet-powered flying wing, a design that some have called the world's first stealth aircraft. It was the brainchild of two brothers, Raymar and Walter Horton, who were passionate believers in the flying wing concept. They argued that by eliminating the tail and fuselage, you could drastically reduce drag, making the aircraft faster and more fuel efficient. The Horton brothers had been experimenting with glider designs for years. They built a series of increasingly sophisticated unpowered flying wings. The war gave them the opportunity to build a powered version. They proposed their design to the head of the German Air Force, who was looking for a $3,000 bomber, a plane that could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, a distance of 1,000 kilometers, at a speed of 1,000 kilometers per hour. The Horton design seemed to fit the bill. They built a prototype, the Ho 229 V1, which was an unpowered glider to test the aerodynamics. It flew beautifully. The next step was to add jet engines. The second prototype, the V2, was fitted with two of the same Jumo 4 engines used in the Me 262. It made its first powered flight on February 2, 1945. The test pilot was thrilled. The plane was fast, stable, and handled well. Tragically, on its third flight, one of the engines failed, and the aircraft crashed, killing the pilot. Despite the crash, the project showed immense promise. A third prototype, the V3, was under construction when the war ended. It was a more advanced version, intended to be the template for the production model. When American troops from the U.S. 8th Army Corps arrived at the Friedrich-Croda factory in April 1945, they found the nearly completed V3 airframe. They carefully packed it up and shipped it back to the United States for study. That same aircraft is now in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, where it has been studied for decades. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Ho 229 is the claim that it was a stealth aircraft. Raymar Horton claimed years later that he had intended to mix charcoal dust with the glue used to bond the plywood layers of the aircraft's skin. The idea was that the charcoal would absorb electromagnetic waves, making it harder for radar to detect. In 2008, Northrop Grumman, the builders of the modern B-2 stealth bomber, which is also a flying wing, conducted a study. They built a full-scale replica of the Ho 229 center section to test its radar cross-section. The results, documented in the National Geographic documentary Hitler's Stealth Fighter, were fascinating. They concluded that the Ho 229's shape and non-metallic construction would have made it significantly harder to detect with the British early warning radar of the time. It wouldn't have been invisible, but it might have appeared on radar much later than a conventional aircraft, giving defenders less time to react. But the true potential of the Ho 229 will never be known. Was the stealth characteristic an intentional design feature from the beginning, or a happy accident that was recognized later? How would the aircraft have performed in actual combat, especially given the unreliability of its early jet engines? And what other secrets are still hidden within the design of the V3 prototype sitting in the Smithsonian storage facility? Number 14, how do you blow up a dam with a bouncing bomb? In the industrial heartland of Germany's Ruhr Valley stood several massive dams. These dams provided water and hydroelectric power to the factories that were the engine of the German war machine. The British believed that if they could destroy these dams, they could cripple industrial production. The problem was, the dams were incredibly tough targets. A conventional bomb dropped from a high altitude would likely miss. A torpedo couldn't be used because the dams were protected by heavy torpedo nets. They needed a new kind of weapon. The challenge was taken up by Barnes Wallis, a brilliant British aeronautical engineer. Wallis was a creative thinker responsible for the geodetic airframe design of the famous Wellington bomber. He came up with a radical idea. What if you could design a bomb that skipped across the surface of the water, like a skimming stone, jump over the torpedo nets, and then sink right next to the dam wall? The water pressure at that depth would then focus the force of the explosion directly onto the dam, causing a catastrophic breach. It was a wild theory. The bomb itself, codenamed Upkeep, was a large cylindrical mine. It weighed over 9,000 pounds, with more than 6,000 pounds of that being a powerful explosive called Torpex. To make it skip, Wallis realized it had to be spinning backward at high speed when it was dropped. This backspin would keep it on the surface of the water for a series of bounces. The challenge was immense. The bomb had to be dropped from a precise, dangerously low altitude, exactly 60 feet. It It had to be dropped at a precise speed, 220 miles per hour, and it had to be dropped at a precise distance from the damn wall. To deliver this unique weapon, the Avro Lancaster bombers of the newly formed 617 Squadron, later known as the Dumbusters, had to be heavily modified. The bomb bay doors were removed to accommodate the large, odd-shaped bomb. A special motor was installed to spin the bomb before release. Since altimeters were not accurate enough at such a low altitude, a simple but ingenious solution was devised. Two spotlights were mounted on the aircraft, one under the nose and one under the fuselage, angled so their beams would converge into a single spot on the surface of the water when the plane was at exactly 60 feet. To get the distance right, they used a simple wooden sighting device that looked like a triangle. The pilot had to line up two towers on the dam with two pins on the sight. The raid, codenamed Operation Chastis, took place on the night of May 16 to 17, 1943. Led by the 24-year-old wing commander Guy Gibson, 19 Lancasters took off for Germany. The flying was incredibly dangerous at treetop level to avoid radar. The crews faced intense anti-aircraft fire. In the end, two dams, the Mone and the Eder, were successfully breached. A third, the Sorp, was damaged. The resulting floods caused significant short-term disruption to German industry and transport, as detailed in books like Paul Brickhill's The Dam Busters. The raid was a huge propaganda victory for the Allies, but the cost was high. 8 of the 19 bombers and 53 of the 133 aircrew did not return. But many questions still shadow this famous raid. Was the strategic damage to German industry as significant as initially claimed, or did they recover much faster than expected? Was the immense human cost of the raid, both in terms of the aircrew lost and the German civilians killed in the floods, justified by the military outcome? And what other seemingly impossible engineering problems did Barnes-Wallis try to solve with his unconventional thinking during the war? Number 13. Could a bomb be steered like a plane? For most of the war, bombing was a matter of statistics. You dropped a lot of bombs from a high altitude and hoped that some of them would hit the target. It was incredibly inaccurate, but what if you could guide a bomb to its target after it had been dropped? This was the idea behind a new class of weapons known as guided munitions. One of the earliest and most successful was the German Henschel H-1's 293. It wasn't just a bomb, it was a small rocket-powered glider with a warhead. Developed by the Henschel Aircraft Company, the HS-293 looked like a miniature airplane attached to the bottom of a bomb. It had wings, a tail, and a liquid fuel rocket motor underneath. A large bomber like a Heinkel He 177 or a Dornier Du 217 would carry the weapon to the target area. The bomber would have to fly above and to the side of the target, usually a ship. After releasing the HS-293, the rocket motor would fire for about 10 seconds, accelerating the weapon and giving it distance from the bomber. From there, it would glide towards the target. The guidance system was the key. It was a radio-controlled system. An operator inside the bomber, called the bombardier, would watch the weapon as it flew. The HS-293 had a small flare in its tail to make it easier to see. The bombardier used a special joystick to send radio commands to the bomb, controlling its flight path by moving small control surfaces on its tail. It was like flying a remote-controlled airplane. This allowed the bombardier to correct for any errors in the initial drop and steer the weapon directly into the side of an enemy ship. The HS-293 first saw action in August 1943. Its debut was spectacular. On August 25th, a group of German bombers attacked a British flotilla in the Bay of Biscay. They used HS-293s to sink the sloop HMS Egret. This was a landmark event, the first time a ship had been sunk by a guided missile. A few days later, they damaged the Canadian destroyer HMCS Athabascan. The Allies were shocked. They had no defense against this kind of weapon. For a time, the HS-293 was a serious threat, especially in the Mediterranean during the Allied landings at Salerno, Italy. However, the Allies quickly developed countermeasures. They realized the weapon was radio-controlled. They developed equipment known as armors that could broadcast radio signals on the same frequency the Germans were using. This would interfere with the control signals, causing the missile to go out of control and miss its target. The effectiveness of the HS-293 dropped significantly once these jammers were widely deployed. Despite this, it remains a pioneering weapon, a direct ancestor of the modern anti-ship missiles that are a staple of navies around the world. The technical details are outlined in historical analyses, like German guided missiles of World War II by Roland F. Pocock. But some things are still not fully understood. How many Allied ships were actually sunk or damaged by these guided weapons, and how much was this information suppressed to maintain morale? What other, more advanced guidance systems, perhaps using television or wire guidance, were the Germans developing to overcome the Allied jammers? And did the focus on these complex weapons divert valuable resources from producing more conventional aircraft and munitions that might have been more effective in the long run? Number 12. What if you could drop a bomb that pierced steel like a needle? While the HS-293 was designed as a gliding weapon, another German-guided bomb took a different approach. This one was designed for pure power and penetration. It was called the Fritz X, and it was essentially a 3,400-pound armor-piercing bomb with fins and a radio control system. It was designed to be dropped from high altitude to sink heavily armored warships like battleships and heavy cruisers. The Fritz X was a simple but deadly concept. It was a standard armor-piercing bomb, but with a new tail section added. This tail had 4 small wings. On the end of each wing were spoilers, small metal plates that could be moved to steer the bomb. Like the HS-293, it was controlled by a bombardier in the launch aircraft using a joystick. The bomb was designed to be dropped from about 20,000 feet, well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns on ships. As it fell, it would accelerate to nearly the speed of sound. This high velocity, combined with its hardened steel nose, allowed it to punch through the thick deck armor of a warship before exploding deep inside the vessel, where it could do the most damage to boilers and ammunition magazines. Its most famous and devastating use came in September 1943. Italy had just surrendered to the Allies, and the Italian fleet was sailing to Malta to be interned. The German Air Force was ordered to attack them. On September 9th, a squadron of Dornier Du 217 bombers located the Italian fleet. They dropped several Fritz X bombs. One of them scored a direct hit on the brand new Italian battleship Roma. The bomb pierced the deck and exploded in a forward engine room. This started a fire that spread to a magazine, which then exploded. The massive explosion broke the ship in two. The Roma sank, taking over 1,300 crew members with her. Another Fritz X hit her sister ship, the Italia, causing serious damage. This was a shocking demonstration of the power of precision-guided weapons. A single bomb had destroyed a modern battleship. The Fritz X was also used with success against Allied ships during the landings at Salerno. It badly damaged the British battleship HMS Warspite, the American cruiser USS Savannah, and the British cruiser HMS Uganda. For a brief period, the Fritz X gave a handful of German bombers the ability to challenge Allied naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Like the OS-293, the Fritz X's success was short-lived. The Allies deployed radio jammers that disrupted its guidance signals. Also, the bomber had to fly a steady straight course after dropping the bomb so the bombardier could keep it in sight and guide it. This made the bomber a predictable and vulnerable target for Allied fighter planes. As Allied air superiority grew, it became too dangerous for the bombers to use the Fritz X effectively. The era of the guided bomb had begun, but its full potential would not be realized until decades later. But the story of Fritz X leaves us with some unsettling questions. How close did the Allies come to developing their own guided bombs during the war? And why were the German programs so far ahead? Were there plans to fit the Fritz X with a more advanced guidance system? Perhaps one that could home in on the heat or sound of a ship, making it immune to jamming? And what was the full psychological impact on Allied sailors, knowing that a weapon they couldn't dodge could strike them from a bomber they couldn't reach? Well, number 11, could a gun be too big? Sometimes the pursuit of a bigger weapon goes too far. This was the case with the Schwer Gustav, or Heavy Gustav. It was not just a big gun, it was the largest cannon ever built and used in combat. It was a monster of a weapon, a piece of railway artillery so enormous that it defied belief. It was a symbol of the obsession with wonder weapons that could supposedly win the war with a single, devastating blow. The idea for the Gustav gun came in the mid-1930s. The German army wanted a weapon that could destroy the concrete fortifications of the French Maginot Line. The Krupp Steel and Armaments Company was given the task of building it. The result was a gun of epic proportions. The barrel alone was over 100 feet long. The gun's caliber was 80 centimeters or 31.5 inches. It fired two types of shells. The high explosive shell weighed 4.8 tons, the same as a light tank. The concrete-piercing shell weighed 7.1 tons, heavier than a fighter plane, and could penetrate over 20 feet of reinforced concrete. The gun was so large it had to be moved on two parallel sets of railway tracks. It took a crew of 250 men several days just to assemble the gun. Another 2,500 men were needed to lay the track and provide security. The entire assembly, including its railway carriages, was 141 feet long and weighed 1,350 tons. It could fire one shell every 30 to 45 minutes. The range was up to 29 miles. By the time the Gustave gun was ready in 1941, the Maginot Line was irrelevant, and France had already been defeated using fast-moving tank tactics, not by smashing fortifications. The gun needed a new target. In 1942, it was deployed to the Eastern Front for the siege of Sevastopol in the Crimea. Sevastopol was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world, protected by coastal forts and underground ammunition depots. Over a period of about a month, the Gustave gun fired 48 shells. It was successful in destroying several forts. One of its most famous shots was a shell that reportedly plunged through 100 feet of earth to destroy an underground ammo dump built beneath a bay. After Sevastopol, the gun was moved near Leningrad, but the planned attack was cancelled. It was later taken back to Germany for refurbishment. A second gun, named Dora, was also built but saw little or no combat. The Gustave gun was a marvel of engineering, a testament to what was possible. But it was also a strategic failure. It was incredibly impractical, it was slow to move, took weeks to prepare for firing, and was a huge, vulnerable target for air attack. It consumed enormous resources that could have been used to build thousands of tanks or planes. The story is a case study in military gigantism, as documented in books like German Artillery of World War II by Ian V. Hogg. The Gustave gun was eventually captured and scrapped, but it leaves behind some intriguing mysteries. Were there plans to create self-propelled versions of these super heavy guns that didn't rely on railways? What other colossal weapons were designed by Krupp that were so impractical they were never even built? And did the sheer psychological effect of a weapon like the Gustave on the defenders of Sevastopol justify its immense cost and complexity? Number 10, what if you built a tank as big as a ship? If the Gustave gun was the peak of artillery gigantism, the Land Cruiser P-1000 Ratte was its equivalent in tank design. The Ratte, or Rat, was a proposed super heavy tank that would have been less of a tank and more of a rolling fortress. It was a design so outrageously large that it pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. It never left the drawing board, but it represents the ultimate expression of the bigger is better philosophy. The idea was proposed in 1942 by engineers at Krupp. They suggested creating a tank that weighed 1,000 tons. For comparison, the heaviest operational tank of the war, the German Tiger II, weighed about 70 tons. The Ratte would have been over 5 times longer and vastly heavier. It was to be armed with a main turret containing two 280mm naval guns, the same type used on German battleships like the Scharnhorst. This would have given it the firepower to destroy any target from miles away. For defense against closer targets, it was supposed to have multiple smaller cannons and numerous anti-aircraft guns. The tank would have been 115 feet long, 46 feet wide, and 36 feet tall. Its armor was to be up to 9 inches thick. To move this 1,000-ton behemoth, the plans called for either 2 marine diesel engines, the kind used in U-boats, or 8 smaller diesel engines, creating a combined output of over 16,000 horsepower. It would have moved on 3 enormous treads on each side, each tread being nearly 4 feet wide. The crew was projected to be between 20 and 40 men, and it would have even included a small vehicle bay for motorcycles for scouting. The project was championed by some within the German armaments ministry. A study was ordered, and the project was given its official designation. But Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments and War Production, saw the project for what it was: a complete fantasy. In his book Inside the Third Reich, Speer recounts how he personally canceled the project in early 1943. He recognized that it was utterly impractical. The problems with the Ratte were endless. It would have been so heavy it would have destroyed any road it drove on. It couldn't cross most bridges. Its fuel consumption would have been astronomical. It would have been a massive, slow-moving target for any Allied bomber. Getting it to a battlefield would have been a logistical nightmare. It was a weapon designed without any thought for the realities of war. It was a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, of an engineer, not a soldier. Though it was never built, the Land Cruiser Ratte remains a fascinating what-if of the war. but it also raises serious questions. How seriously was this project actually considered by the German High Command? What does the existence of such a design tell us about the state of mind of the engineers and planners who proposed it? And were there any other, even more fantastic Papa Panzer projects that have been lost to history? At number 9, how do you stick a bomb to the side of a tank? Not all secret weapons were high-tech marvels. Some were simple, crude, and desperate. The British sticky bomb was one of these. It was officially known as the No 74 grenade, and it was designed as a last-ditch anti-tank weapon for the British Home Guard in 1940. At the time, Britain was facing the very real threat of a German invasion, and they were desperately short of proper anti-tank guns. They needed something cheap and easy to produce that could be used by civilians to stop a tank. The sticky bomb was the creation of a group of unconventional weapons designers. The core of the weapon was a glass flask filled with about 1.5 pounds of nitroglycerin, a powerful but notoriously unstable explosive. The flask was covered in a knitted wool sock that was coated in a thick, sticky substance called birdlime. The whole thing was enclosed in a thin metal casing. To use it, a soldier would pull a pin, which would release the outer casing. They then had to run up to an enemy tank and physically slam the bomb against its armor. The idea was that the sticky coating would hold the bomb in place. The soldier would then pull a second pin to start a 5-second fuse and run for cover. It was a truly terrifying weapon to use. The user had to get dangerously close to an enemy tank. The bomb was heavy and awkward. The adhesive was a problem. In testing, it was found that if the tank was covered in mud or dust, the bomb wouldn't stick. In a famous and possibly apocryphal story, the bomb first demonstrated to the Prime Minister Winston Churchill failed to stick to a dusty tank and instead stuck to the leg of his trousers. The nitroglycerin was also sensitive to shock. There was a real danger that the bomb could detonate prematurely if it was handled roughly or dropped. Despite these major flaws, over 2.5 million sticky bombs were produced. They were issued to the Home Guard, as well as regular army units in North Africa and Europe. While it was never a popular weapon, it did see some limited combat use. It was a weapon born of desperation, a symbol of a time when Britain was preparing to fight for its survival on its own beaches. It highlights the brutal, close-quarters reality of anti-tank warfare before the development of more sophisticated rocket launchers. The history of these ad hoc weapons is detailed in sources like the archives of the British Imperial War Museum. But the full story of the sticky bomb is still unclear. How many enemy tanks were actually destroyed or disabled by this weapon in combat? And were there any recorded instances of the bomb detonating prematurely and killing its user? And what other strange improvised anti-tank weapons were developed by the British in the desperate days of 1940? Number 8. Could a pigeon guide a missile? This sounds like a cartoon plot, but it was a serious military research project. During the war, the United States was working on guided missiles, but the technology for guidance systems was in its infancy. Electronics were bulky and unreliable, so one of the most brilliant and eccentric psychologists of the 20th century, B.F. Skinner, proposed a radical solution: use pigeons. Skinner was a pioneer of behaviorism, the study of how behavior is shaped by rewards and punishments. He knew he could train pigeons to perform complex tasks with incredible accuracy. His idea, called Project Pigeon, later Project Orcon, for organic control, was to place a pigeon inside the nose cone of a missile. In front of the pigeon would be a screen showing an image of the target projected through a lens. The pigeon would be trained to recognize the shape of a target, like a ship or a building. It would then be trained to peck at the center of that target on the screen. The screen was connected to the missile's flight controls. If the pigeon pecked in the center, the missile would fly straight. If the target moved to the side of the screen, the pigeon would move its head and peck at the new position. These pecks would be registered by sensors, which would then send a signal to the missile's fins, steering it back on course, so the target was in the center of the screen again. Essentially, the pigeon would be a living, breathing, biological guidance system. To improve reliability, Skinner proposed using 3 pigeons in each missile, with the missile's course determined by the majority vote of their pecks. The project was funded by the National Defense Research Committee. Skinner and his team successfully trained pigeons to track targets with remarkable precision. They could keep a target centered even when the image was moving quickly. In a declassified 1944 film of the project, you can see the pigeons reliably pecking away at images of ships. They were not distracted by noise, pressure changes, or other disturbances. They were perfect little pilots. However, military officials were deeply skeptical. The idea of entrusting a missile to a bird seemed ridiculous. Despite successful demonstrations, the project struggled to gain support. As the war progressed, advances in electronic guidance systems began to make the idea of pigeon guidance seem obsolete. Project Pigeon was eventually canceled in 1944. Skinner was reportedly frustrated, believing that his system was more reliable than the electronic systems that replaced it. The story is a fascinating intersection of psychology and military technology, detailed in Skinner's own writings and later historical accounts of unusual military projects. But what if the project had been taken seriously? Could a pigeon-guided missile have been successfully deployed in combat? How would history have been different if the first successful guided missiles were controlled by animals? And are there any modern military systems that still secretly rely on principles of animal behavior that we don't know about? Number 7. Was there a Japanese suicide rocket? In the final year of the war in the Pacific, a new and terrifying type of attack emerged. Japanese pilots began deliberately crashing their aircraft into Allied ships in organized suicide attacks. These were the kamikaze, but some of these attacks used a weapon that was even more specialized and frightening, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, or Cherry Blossom. To the American sailors who faced it, it had a different name, the Baka bomb. Baka is Japanese for fool or idiot. The Oka was essentially a human-guided cruise missile. It was a small, rocket-powered aircraft, purpose-built for suicide missions. It was not designed to take off from the ground. Instead, a large bomber, typically a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, would carry the Oka under its fuselage to within range of an Allied naval fleet. When a target was identified, the Oka pilot would climb into the tiny cockpit. The Oka would then be released from the mothership. The pilot would first glide the Oka towards the target. When he was close enough, he would fire the Oka's 3 solid-fuel rocket motors. These rockets would fire for only about 10 seconds, but they would accelerate the little plane to incredible speeds, over 600 miles per hour in a dive. At that speed, it was almost impossible to shoot down. The pilot's job was to aim the entire aircraft, including its 2,600-pound warhead in the nose, directly at an American ship. There was no landing gear, there was no way to return. It was a one-way mission. The Oka was first used in combat in March 1945 during the invasion of Okinawa. Its first major success came on April 12th when an Oka hit the American destroyer USS Manor El Abele. The impact and massive explosion broke the destroyer in half, and it sank within minutes. The speed and destructive power of the Oka made it a terrifying weapon. It caused fear and anxiety among U.S. Navy crews. However, the Oka was not a very successful weapon overall. Its biggest weakness was the slow, vulnerable bomber that had to carry it into range. These Betty bombers were easy targets for the swarms of American carrier-based fighter planes like the F-6F Hellcat. Many Okas were shot down before they could even be launched, still attached to their motherships. As documented in books like The Divine Wind Japan's Kamikaze Force in World War II by Rikihei Inaguchi and Tadashi Nakajima, only a small number of Okas ever managed to hit their targets. The Oka represents a dark chapter in the history of military technology. It was a weapon that completely erased the line between the pilot and the projectile. But it leaves us with some haunting questions. What was the psychological profile and training of the young men who volunteered to fly these suicide missions? Were there more advanced versions of the Oka being developed, perhaps ones that could be launched from submarines or land-based catapults? And how did the experience of facing these attacks shape the U.S. Navy's tactics and ship design after the war? Number 6, could a torpedo have a human pilot? Just as the Oka was a piloted bomb, the Japanese also developed a piloted torpedo. It was called the Kaiten, which translates to the return to heaven. Like the Oka, it was a suicide weapon designed for a one-way mission to destroy enemy ships. It was a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war when Japan was facing defeat. The Kaiten was essentially a modified Type 93 long lance torpedo, one of the best naval torpedoes of the war. The standard torpedo was modified to create a small cockpit for a single pilot. The pilot would sit in a cramped space surrounded by controls. He had a small periscope to see his target. The pilot's job was to steer the torpedo on its final run, ensuring a direct hit. The original plan was for the pilot to escape from the Kaiten just before impact, but this was quickly found to be impossible. It became a pure suicide weapon. The Kaitens were launched from the decks of submarines. The submarine would have to sneak past the anti-submarine screens of an Allied fleet to get into a position to launch. Once launched, the pilot would use his periscope to aim at the target and then dive to a set depth for the final attack run. The Caton had a huge 3,400-pound warhead, much larger than a standard torpedo, making it capable of sinking even the largest ships with a single hit. The Caton program was shrouded in secrecy. The pilots were young volunteers, often from universities, who were sworn to secrecy. They lived in isolated bases and underwent intense training. Their motivations were complex, rooted in a culture of honor and sacrifice. The Caton's first successful attack was in November 1944. A Caton launched from a submarine hit the U.S. fleet oiler USS Mississinawa while it was at anchor in the Ulithi Atoll. The ship exploded in a massive fireball and sank. This success proved the concept, and the program was expanded. However, like the Oka, the Caton's overall success rate was very low. The submarines carrying them were often sunk before they could get into position. The Catons themselves were difficult to control and had mechanical problems. It's estimated that only 2 other Allied ships were sunk by Catons during the entire war. The human cost was high both for the Caton pilots and the crews of the submarines that carried them. The personal stories of these pilots are explored in works like Suicide Submarine by Yutaka Yokota. The Caton was a weapon of desperation, a fusion of man and machine in the most final way possible, but its history is still not fully clear. How many Caton missions were actually launched, and what really happened on those that never returned? Were there plans to create 2-man or even air-launched versions of the Caton? And how did the Allies first learn about this secret underwater threat? Number 5, what if you could weaponize the sun? Of all the wonder weapon concepts developed during the war, perhaps none was as ambitious or as outlandish as the sun gun. This was not a weapon that was ever built. It was a theoretical concept for a space-based weapon of immense power. It was an idea that belonged more in a science fiction story than on a military drawing board. The idea originated with the German rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth. As early as 1923, he had written about the possibility of placing a giant mirror in orbit around the Earth. The mirror could be used to reflect and focus sunlight onto a specific point on the Earth's surface. During the war, a group of German scientists at a research facility in Hillersleben apparently took this idea and began to study its potential as a weapon. According to post-war interrogations of German scientists and recovered documents, the plan was truly enormous. They envisioned a mirror made of metallic sodium, perhaps over a mile wide. This mirror would be assembled in Earth orbit, about 5,100 miles up, be part of a manned space station. The station would have hydroponic gardens to grow food, a solar-powered generator, and docking ports for resupply rockets. It would be a permanent military base in space. The giant mirror would be used to focus the sun's energy into a concentrated beam. This beam could be directed at any target on Earth. The theory was that it could boil oceans, burn cities to the ground, and destroy entire armies. It would be the ultimate weapon, a death ray that could strike anywhere on the planet with no warning. The project was sometimes referred to as the helioprojector. Of course, the technology to build such a thing did not exist in the 1940s. The V-2 rocket was the most advanced rocket of the day, and it could barely reach the edge of space for a few minutes. The idea of lifting thousands of tons of material into a stable orbit and assembling a space station was pure fantasy. There is debate among historians about how seriously this project was ever taken by the German High Command. Was it a genuine research project, or was it just the theoretical scribblings of a few imaginative scientists? Some evidence was published in a 1945 article in Life magazine, which brought the concept to public attention. The Sun Gun project never went anywhere. It was a dream of absolute power, but it shows how far some scientists were thinking. They were already imagining the weaponization of space, decades before the first satellite was even launched. It makes you wonder, were the initial calculations about the weapon's power even correct, or would atmospheric diffusion have made it far less effective than they believed? Were there any other space-based weapon concepts being secretly studied during the war? And how much did these early German ideas influence the American and Soviet space programs, particularly the secret military ones, during the Cold War? Number 4. Could a giant, rocket-powered wheel be a weapon? Some secret weapons are terrifying, some are ingenious, and some are just bizarre. The Great Panjandrum falls firmly into the last category. It was a British weapon designed to solve a specific problem: how to breach the thick concrete defenses of the Atlantic Wall, the German fortifications along the coast of France, during the D-Day landings. The idea was conceived by the British Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a department known for its eccentric inventions. They were nicknamed the Weasers and Dodgers. The Panjandrum was essentially a giant, mobile demolition charge. It consisted of two large 10-foot-tall steel wheels, like a giant pair of cartwheels. An axle connected them, and the axle was packed with thousands of pounds of explosives. The motive power was provided by a series of solid fuel rockets attached to the wheels. The plan was for a landing craft to approach the beach, open its ramp, light the rockets, and unleash the Panjandrum. It would then roll up the beach at high speed, smash through any obstacles, and detonate against a concrete wall, blasting a hole big enough for tanks and troops to pass through. That was the theory. The reality was very different. The project was developed in extreme secrecy. Tests were conducted on a remote beach in Devon. The tests were a complete disaster. In the first test, with only a few rockets attached, the Panjandrum rolled a short distance and then fell over. More rockets were added. In subsequent tests, the rockets on one wheel would sometimes fire with more force than the ones on the other, causing the whole contraption to veer wildly off course. On other occasions, rockets would break off and fly across the beach like stray missiles, scattering the observers who were watching from a safe distance in concrete bunkers. The final test was the most infamous. It was filmed, and the footage is now famous. The Panjandrum was launched from a landing craft. It trundled up the beach, shedding rockets as it went. It then began to swerve uncontrollably, turning back towards the sea. It skidded and cartwheeled across the sand, narrowly missing a cameraman and sending high-ranking military observers scrambling for cover. It was completely uncontrollable and dangerously unpredictable. The project was quietly canceled. The Panjandrum was a spectacular failure. It was an idea that seemed plausible on paper, but was impossible to control in the real world. It serves as a comical but important reminder that not every wartime invention was a success. For every brilliant bouncing bomb, there was a ridiculous, uncontrollable rocket wheel. But even this comical failure leaves us with questions. Was there any version of the Panjandrum, perhaps with a better steering mechanism or a more stable design, that might have actually worked? Are the surviving films of the tests the complete record, or were there other, even more disastrous tests that were kept secret? And what other completely outlandish but ultimately failed weapon ideas are still buried in the archives of the Weezers and Dodgers? Number 3, what if an aircraft carrier was made of ice? In the early years of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic was a desperate struggle. German U-boats were sinking vast numbers of Allied merchant ships, threatening to starve Britain into surrender. One of the biggest problems was the mid-Atlantic gap, an area of the ocean beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft. In this gap, convoys were vulnerable to U-boat attacks. The Allies needed a way to provide air cover. The answer seemed to be aircraft carriers, but steel was a critical and scarce resource. This is where Geoffrey Pike entered the story. Pike was a brilliant but highly eccentric inventor and advisor to the British Combined Operations Headquarters. He proposed a radical solution. Why not build aircraft carriers out of a material that was cheap, readily available, and floated? Why not build them out of ice? This was not as crazy as it sounded. Pike knew that regular ice was too brittle. But he had learned about a new, incredibly strong composite material. It was made by mixing a small amount of wood pulp with water and then freezing it. The resulting substance, later named picrete in his honor, was remarkably tough. It was much stronger than ice, had a very slow melting rate, and was as hard as concrete. To demonstrate its properties, Lord Mountbatten, the head of Combined Operations, reportedly fired a pistol at a block of regular ice, which shattered. He then fired at a block of picrete, and the bullet ricocheted off, grazing an admiral. The plan, codenamed Project Habakkuk, was breathtaking in its scale. They proposed to build an enormous ship, 2,000 feet long and weighing 2 million tons. It would have been the largest naval vessel ever constructed. The hull would be made of 40-foot thick blocks of picrete. A complex network of refrigeration pipes would run through the hull, powered by a massive onboard plant to keep the picrete from melting. The ship would be slow and cumbersome, but it would be essentially unsinkable. A torpedo would only chip a small hole in its massive ice hull. It would carry about 150 aircraft and be a floating, indestructible airbase in the middle of the Atlantic. The project was taken seriously. A prototype was built on Patricia Lake in Alberta, Canada. A small, 60-foot-long model was constructed and kept frozen through a hot summer using a small refrigeration unit. The tests proved that the concept was viable, but they also revealed the immense engineering challenges. The amount of steel needed for the refrigeration plant was almost as much as for a conventional carrier. The cost was astronomical, and the ship would be so slow it would be difficult to maneuver. In the end, Project Habakkuk was canceled. The tide of the war was turning. New long-range aircraft were developed that could close the mid-Atlantic gap. More conventional escort carriers were being built in American shipyards at a rapid pace. The need for a giant ice carrier faded away. The remains of the prototype at Patricia Lake slowly melted and sank to the bottom, where divers can still see them today. But the legend of Project Habakkuk lives on. Was it a brilliant, innovative solution that was simply made obsolete by other technologies? Or was it an impractical fantasy from the start? What other incredible uses for Picrite were being considered? And if one of these massive ice ships had been built, how would it have changed the course of naval history? Number 2. Could you send bombs to America on the wind? In late 1944 and early 1945, people on the west coast of the United States and Canada began to find strange things. Large paper balloons, about 33 feet in diameter, were found in forests, on farms, and in remote areas. Some had strange equipment attached. Some had explosives. These were the Fugo weapons, Japan's secret attempt to attack the North American mainland. It was one of the strangest and most imaginative weapons programs of the war. The idea was to use the jet stream, the high-altitude winds that blow from west to east across the Pacific Ocean. And Japanese scientists, led by Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba, had discovered these powerful and consistent winds. They realized they could use them to carry bombs all the way from Japan to America. They designed a balloon made of paper, glued together with a paste made from a root vegetable. The balloon was filled with hydrogen. The Fugo, or fire balloon, was an ingenious piece of automated technology. It carried about 30 pounds of high explosive or incendiary bombs. To stay at the correct altitude, around 30,000 feet, for the 3-day journey across the Pacific, it had a clever control system. A series of barometers were connected to small sandbags. If the balloon dipped too low, a barometer would trigger the release of a sandbag, making the balloon lighter and causing it to rise. If it went too high during the day, the sun would heat the hydrogen, causing it to expand and escape through a valve, making the balloon descend. At night, as the gas cooled, the balloon would drop, triggering the release of another sandbag. After a set number of sandbags were dropped, a final mechanism would release the bombs and then light a fuse to destroy the balloon itself. Japan launched over 9,000 of these balloons. It's estimated that about 1,000 of them reached North America, landing as far east as Michigan and as far south as Mexico. The campaign was intended to cause panic and start massive forest fires. However, it was largely a failure. Most of the balloons landed in remote, unpopulated areas. The timing was also bad. They were launched during the winter, when the forests were wet and less likely to burn. The U.S. government imposed a strict press blackout on the balloon incidents. They didn't want the Japanese to know if their weapons were working, and they didn't want to cause public panic. The censorship was so effective that the Japanese concluded the campaign was a failure and stopped it in April 1945. There was one tragic exception to the secrecy. In May 1945, a woman and 5 children on a church outing in Oregon came across one of the balloons. They tried to move it, and the bomb it was carrying exploded, killing all 6 of them. They were the only known casualties from enemy action on the U.S. mainland during the war. The Fugo balloon bomb was a remarkable feat of engineering, a simple but clever intercontinental weapon. It was the first weapon system in history to have a truly global reach, but many questions remain unanswered. How did the Japanese military maintain such incredible secrecy around the launch sites? Were there plans to use the balloons to deliver more sinister payloads, such as biological weapons? And how many unexploded Fugo bombs are still lying undiscovered in the remote wilderness of North America? Number 1. What if your bombs were carried by bats? Of all the strange ideas for weapons during the war, the bat bomb might be the most unbelievable. The plan was to attach tiny incendiary bombs to millions of bats, drop them over Japanese cities, and have the bats roost in the wooden buildings, starting thousands of fires simultaneously. It was a bizarre, surreal, and surprisingly well-researched project. The idea came from a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania named Lytle S. Adams. He was on vacation in New Mexico and was impressed by the huge swarms of bats emerging from Carlsbad Caverns. He knew that Japanese cities were built largely of wood and paper. He wrote to the White House with his idea. It sounds like something that would be immediately dismissed, but the letter made its way to President Roosevelt, who was intrigued. He approved the project, noting, "This man is not a nut." The project was given to the U.S. Army Air Forces. The plan was to capture millions of Mexican free-tailed bats. A tiny incendiary bomb, weighing less than an ounce, was developed. It used napalm and had a chemical time delay fuse. The bombs would be attached to the bats with a surgical clip. The bats would then be placed in special refrigerated containers that would cool them down and force them into hibernation. These containers, each holding about 1,000 bats, would be dropped from a bomber at high altitude. A parachute would deploy, and as the container fell, it would warm up, waking the bats. The container would then open, releasing the swarm of bats, each carrying a tiny firebomb. The theory was that the bats would fly out and find places to hide from the daylight. They would roost in the attics, eaves, and walls of buildings all over a city. After a set time, the fuses would ignite the bombs, and thousands of small, difficult-to-reach fires would start all at once, overwhelming the city's firefighters and creating a massive firestorm. The project went through several stages of testing. A mock Japanese village was built at a test site in Utah. In one test, the bats performed exactly as expected, burning the village to the ground. The project showed real promise. However, it was also plagued with problems. In one infamous incident at an auxiliary air base in Carlsbad, New Mexico, some of the armed bats accidentally escaped, and they roosted under a fuel tank and in the rafters of a hangar and a general's car. The resulting fires destroyed the hangar and the general's car. Despite the successful tests, the project moved slowly. It was eventually passed from the Army to the Navy and then to the Marine Corps. By 1944, the program was competing for resources and attention with a much bigger, more powerful secret weapon, the atomic bomb. The bat bomb was estimated to be ready for use in mid-1945, but leaders decided that the atomic bomb was a much faster and more certain way to end the war. The bat bomb project was canceled, but it was not a complete fantasy. It was a serious, well-funded project that came close to being deployed. What if the bat bomb had been used? Could it have been as destructive as its designers claimed? What would the psychological impact have been of a weapon that used living creatures to start fires? And what other secret projects, using animals as weapons, were considered and then abandoned during the war?